Morning, everybody. How we doing today? It's a Thursday here in Minnesota. Early September. There's crisp in the air. Fall has arrived. To be honest, summer gets long in this building. It gets pretty hot down here, so I don't really mind summer moving along, as it were, even though it means you're one season older. First thing I want to talk about today is I've had some interesting feedback on the podcast, and it sounds like I'm just going to start putting some of my audio for some of my better episodes into podcast format. And where do you guys want that material? I know there's a Google podcasting, there's some kind of phone app. Give me some feedback on that, because I've never watched a podcast in my life, so I don't get time to do a whole lot besides listen to records. That's what I do. It's what I sit around doing. Before I started YouTube, I don't think I watched anything on YouTube besides an old metal video once in a while from my childhood, which happened to be on YouTube, but I don't really stay abreast with technology like probably I should, but part of being older, I think. So again, feedback on podcast, where it should be posted or like placed, so people can all access it who want to access it. And I think it's great that people want to listen to it when they go for a walk, or it's great and reassuring that my narrative is that fluid and easy to listen to. I find that comforting. Listening to a lot of people talk isn't always that enjoyable. So it takes a certain magnetism, a certain charisma, I think, to be compelling as a speaker. And so it thrills me that people find me that easy to listen to for 15, 20, 30 minutes. That's great. How long do you guys want podcasts to be? Do you want them just to be complete audio from the episode? So if it's 20 minutes, if it's 50 minutes, do you want them to be more episodic, where I cut episodes into 10, 15 minute segments? Again, I don't really know much about this stuff, so give me some feedback, guys, on that. Moving along, one thing I've been kind of curious about lately, and I get into some hot water at times because of how I feel about modern and new jazz, and whether or not jazz that's current, not that it's good or not. I'm not saying any cats can't play. It just feels a little different to me. But I do think when you live in New York City, like my friend Ken does, you get so immersed into the jazz community and culture that exists there still, that it kind of shades your perspectives on what the jazz community is like abroad. And I can tell you firsthand, the average New Yorker's concept of what lies beyond the Hudson River is often fairly minimal. There was an old cartoon back in the day that had the New Jersey shore across the river as essentially being the West Coast. Like, it's all middle America once you get past the Hudson River. And if you live in New York, there's not a lot of reason to leave New York. Everything you could possibly need is there somewhere in those great islands and the great conglomeration that is New York City. But I think sometimes you live there, you get kind of tunnel vision. You get kind of, I think when you're in Canada, you think hockey's bigger than it is everywhere. And hockey's not that big in most places. I think with a lot of the people who think about jazz and its current applicability, it's just not around the country. There's probably a pretty good scene in New Orleans still, mostly traditional, but probably some modern. But New Orleans definitely has a jazz scene that's still pretty comprehensive and omnipresent. But again, a lot of it's rooted in the old traditional sounds. Aside from that, New York, where is there still a great, strong jazz scene? From what I've heard, even LA is kind of a desert for jazz clubs and jazz community. So it's just, I wonder sometimes, is part of being in New York, being around what's cutting edge in jazz still, having accessibility to the jazz radio cats, the shows, the publications, everything is so New York centric, especially in the remnants of what the jazz industry is today. I think if you live outside of New York, you're not really privy to most of what's happening in jazz, and it doesn't really exist. I hear about some of it, but it doesn't really seem to have much parallel here anywhere close to me. I would give another example: the record buying craze, the vinyl buying craze is big, and in our minds, because we're so immersed into it, we feel like it's omnipresent. But we're still a very small chunk of society, and 95% of people still don't. Records are still made. Like, it's not like everyone knows about records, and those are distributed around the country. So I think knowledge of jazz, when you live in New York, is much more general and much more commonplace. But I think it also colors their perspective of how popular and alive jazz is. Jazz in the backwoods, in the countryside, doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. And most people in this town would have a hard time naming one jazz cat. Probably Armstrong, maybe Miles. That's it. You know, my brothers who know I run a jazz channel, you know next to nothing about jazz. And they know about it, but they don't know nothing about it. You know, it's regional at best. And it's really... New York's a privilege to be there. But it also comes with a certain set of parameters that I think informs how New Yorkers think. And New Yorkers think in a way different from most Americans anyway. New Yorkers have always been a much broader culture, society, than the rest of America has been. New York's been connected to the world far more than the rest of America has been. New York's always been 10, 15 years ahead of the rest of America in social, political thinking, and the adaptations that were made during the immigration waves, where we started dealing with tenement housing and some of the unemployment issues, and just what did we do with the mountains of poverty? You know, New York had to address that stuff all first. And being the great first urban conglomeration that was global in its scope, New York did face a lot of issues that had never been faced by a city before. And it's quite an interesting story in and of itself, New York. It's a fantastic urban experience and experiment in humanity that manages to always kind of reinvent itself. Right now, it's kind of becoming a hideout for the elite, and they've kind of purified it of all the undesirables. But my guess is that's going to all go full circle once again. And in 30, 40 years, a lot of those neighborhoods will once again be housing the art communities and the desolate and the, who knows, you know, but things seem to go full cycle, especially with real estate cycles. But, so yeah, just how much does New York inform New Yorkers' opinions? How much does New York shade their perspective of how big jazz is and how current jazz is? My guess it does deceive them some. Because when you live here in rural Minnesota outside of Rochester, jazz ain't on. The only thing jazz is to these people is that stuff they hear when they walk by my building through the window. That's what jazz is to anybody in this town. Oh, that building over there, I think they play a lot. I got here coming out in the summertime. I don't think there's any grasp of jazz beyond that. Even the great high school jazz bands are no longer. Music programs don't exist anymore. The American Songbook is losing its footing in the American people, because we used to have these great high school choirs where you would learn this material, where you were in jazz band where you would learn this material, and it might have been somewhat of a watered down, but you still got to know these songs. And that all that stuff's been slashed and cut and burnt off the curriculum for public schools, and it's leaving just the private schools to offer some of that stuff for the most part. And some schools still have music programs, some schools still have choirs, but it's certainly slashing in the poor neighborhoods especially. One of the great tragedies is how much we allocate school funding based off local, regional tax base. So if you live in a poor neighborhood, your schools are automatically going to be poorer. And that seems like a great inequality in a land that talks about equality frequently. But I'm going to move on. New York, I love you. Ken, I love you. But here in the Midwest, what a New Yorker thinks doesn't have a lot of say or reality based to it. It just doesn't. I guess I'm going to move on. We'll talk to you briefly about Oscar Pettiford, one of the great innovators in the music. He made some pretty important recordings. Listen to that. Oh. That's the French horn of Julius Watkins, who ends up playing with Charlie Rouse in the Les mode for a number of years. And Watkins has a number of very interesting recordings. Watkins and Rouse are both on this, along with pianist Julius Watkins. Ron Jefferson's on the drums. And Pettiford is playing cello and the bass. And he uses the cello, it seems like, to have that punctuated mid-range tone that at times when he's doing his instrumentating and soloing, it almost sounds like a guitar because he's so fluent with it. This song really jumped off the page of me the other day. The French horn is just gorgeous. This album also features Trichotism, one of his big tracks that he wrote and composed. Listen to this. Sounds like guitar. But that's not. That's a very well-played cello by the great Oscar Pettiford. Just gorgeous. I looked for a second, like, who's playing the guitar? And no, that's just cello. And it just shows you some of his innovation, some of his ability to reinvent instruments that weren't being really utilized in jazz. Pettiford's a real brilliant guy, comes along in the bebop era, plays in a lot of really important recordings. And this is a 10-inch at Bethlehem from probably 53, 54, probably 53. Outstanding stuff. You know, not too tough to find, but not easy to find either. Bethlehem 10 inches are always worth it if you see them. They're across the board fantastic. Next, I want to talk to you about a record I played yesterday. And that's by the great Hank Mobley once again. Kind of going through his early work. And one of the real revelations on this record is the playing of the great Art Farmer. And Farmer's more of a kind of concise, very melodic, gentle player. And you hear an edge and a brightness to him and an aggression that I think playing with these guys brings out of him. Which, again, most of the great players are going to be impacted by who they're playing with. Hank Mobley was one of the greats in that regard. He always was impacted by who he played with. What's cool about this record from 1955, listen to Art. I had a double take when I heard that. I'm like, I don't think that's Morgan. I don't think it's Bird. And I looked and was like, Art Farmer. I'm like, wow, that's a fairly bright, concise, aggressive sounding Art Farmer in this setting, which is not really where you hear Art Farmer. And Farmer shows up at 55, 56 quite a bit at Blue Note as a sideman, not as a leader ever, which is a shame. It would have been nice to have a couple Art Farmer sessions that he led, but he's definitely on at least a dozen recordings in that era as a sideman. And he plays some of his most aggressive stuff with the Blue Note Cats. Another cool thing about this record, 1550 I believe, is it's essentially the 55 Jazz Messenger lineup. You take out Donald Byrd and you put in Art Farmer, and what you have left is Hank Mobley, Horace Silver, Doug Watkins, and Art Blakey. That's that 55 Columbia Jazz Messenger lineup. And so what's interesting how that lineup disintegrates. Silver, Watkins, and Mobley go their own way. And Mobley goes out on his own as a leader, which is one of the things that Blakey was always kind of pushing his guys out to start their own groups. And yet, even though the band had dissolved and there was some tension between Horace and Art, they were still willing to make recordings together, especially for their good friend Hank. Of course, Hank, I'd love to play on your Blue Note record. Of course, I'll work with Horace again on this, no question about it. Where Donald was at this point, it's hard to say. He's making those great records that transition in this period between his early Columbia Blue Messenger and his return to Blue Note in 58, 59. He's making those great transition records, which are solid recordings without question. But so you have basically the Jazz Messengers with Art Farmer, the 55 Jazz Messengers. And again, the Jazz Messenger lineup changes a lot from year to year. But this is one of my favorite iterations of the Messengers. I was chatting with one of my friends on Facebook the other day, and it's interesting how that second Messenger lineup with Bill Harmon and Spanky DeBrest and Johnny Griffin's in there a little bit, Jackie McLean's in there at times. That group never sounds as focused and as intense as what came before or what comes after. And the question was, has it got something to do with the label recording? Was it Bethlehem? Was it Pacific? And again, there's so many different labels that record that version of the Messengers. Jubilee has a session. There's just a lot of different record labels. That Elektra did a session that was nice. There's just a less intense sound to that second group of the Jazz Messengers. And when they come back in 58, 59 with Golson, and then we get eventually Shorter and Morgan and Fuller and all those cats, they're definitely the most aggressive sounding group in jazz. They're at the cutting edge of aggression and tension. You know, they really are addressing those things like nobody else in the business. But anyway, a great session. You're essentially talking Jazz Messenger lineup here with Art Farmer in place. And it's really a great record. It's actually probably better than I remembered it. And I might even give it the nod over the more infamous 1568 Hank Mobley, which everybody loves. But this is a better record than I remember. It's raw, it's tough, it's got just a lot of to it. And that's always what I look for in my jazz records, especially when they're dealing with the hard bop sound. Deliver hard bop. You know, don't bring me milky. I want hard bop when I want hard bop. So again, this is a Japanese pressing, a really tough record to find, 1550. Originals of this go for thousands of dollars, generally speaking, even for beat up copies. I do think it's interesting how records that are of note by artists that are very noteworthy will sometimes languish on Discogs and even in record stores because the consumer doesn't know the label.